Hello, everyone. My name is Tasneem Idris, coordinator of the Mediterranean Dialogue, a network of individuals and think tanks for human flourishing and freedom, advocating to restore the Mediterranean as a bridge for exchange, cooperation, and policy impact. This is the second episode of the MD Voice Mediterranean Dialogue podcast, and it is entitled From Conflict to Migration, Understanding the Roots of Illegal Migration in the Mediterranean and Beyond. We have a very special guest today. His name is Mr. Rainer Gude, expert in international and intercultural relations, specialized in management with a focus in management security, with a focus on dialogue, trust building, facilitation, and conflict resolution. And most importantly, he is a member of the Mediterranean Dialogue International Advisory Board. Mr. Rainer, we're very happy to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Tasneem. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So today we're going to cover three main sections, very important ones. As the title shows, we're going to be focusing on how conflict could lead to migration. And you're very familiar with these areas because you worked literally across the world and dealt with different communities, specifically in Europe and Africa. Many communities that suffered from conflicts and were migrants themselves. You're based in Kenya right now, right?
Yes, I live in Nairobi for the last 2 years.
Okay. And you were raised in the US by a German mother and a Spanish father.
Exactly. And I lived a few years in Switzerland in between, so I've been around.
So you know exactly, the world of migration, its ins and outs.
I do. I admit that I'm a bit of more of a privileged migration, never felt as forced or had to run from conflict or anything like that, or felt climate shock or anything else. My voyage has been less traumatic, but I understand what it is to be an immigrant and what it means to be an outsider and what it means to be welcomed in a whole new space. And I feel that's something that we could all do a little bit better in lots of places around the world.
And you did work with people who suffered from the bad side of migration. Right.
That of course, come across both in the places where I was before. Obviously, here in Kenya, it's quite a big issue. And then in my peace building work, you deal with a lot of people who are either trying to leave, have family who've left. It's migration is not something that is sort of happens out there and it's just something you see on the news. There are a lot of people moving around all over the world and not just to the Mediterranean, through the Mediterranean. And I think there's a lot of great organizations doing work to make sure that this process is more humane and more integrated, but there's a lot of work that we can do to make it better.
Right. And we hope that this podcast, brings about some useful information in that regard. So let's start with the first section. So the first section is about understanding the link between conflict and migration. So how do you think, when it comes to conflicts and political transitions, how do conflicts and political transitions contribute to forced migration, particularly towards Europe? Because the majority of migrants most of them go to Europe.
Yeah, well, listen, when there are conflicts and when there are political transitions, there is instability. Regular system governance break down. Regular systems of finding employment, regular systems of even security are just no longer there. And a lot of times why people will leave is out of a sense of no more hope, a sense of desperation, a sense of, can I survive here? That can be the very urgent one. Sometimes you literally are fleeing active conflict, and other times you are fleeing the fact that you see no more opportunities because of the instability, because of the climate shocks, because of the transition has led to sporadic senses of conflict. I mean, there's a whole spectrum of what conflict constitutes. And people often feel, I have no other option. I'll take this tremendously risky, expensive way out. And if you hear some of the stories, I mean, I'm sure on other podcasts you might go into these, they are heroic travel journeys that people take on with so much uncertainty, and there is no guarantee that they'll get there, and risk of life and risk of danger, and yet they still feel that is their best option, right? And yes, you go to Europe because you feel, and what you hear is that there are more job opportunities, and the quality of life, the possibility of education. Even if you had a higher standing job where you were, we all know that many migrants take on very low paying jobs or willing to do anything just to get out. So obviously there's a lot to unpack in that, but when you leave the sort of various levels of tension that you might have in the different countries where people, tend to migrate a lot from, they are leaving because it's a sense of desperation. There is a sense, it's not just, oh, I'll go make some more money somewhere else. It's because you have no other risk, especially to take on such a journey. I came to every other country I came to by plane, right? I didn't have to walk across the Sahara. I didn't have to take a dangerous boat. It's a totally different experience when you come from a little bit more privilege like you do from and more job opportunities and so on than these people who are fleeing conflict. It's a totally different experience.
Right. So this leads me to my second question. From your experience, what are the most significant push factors driving people to risk illegal migration? I know you touched upon this a little bit, but I think my question would be about how can they just, risk, their lives and throw themselves in the ocean or the Mediterranean. This means that they have nothing to lose, quite frankly, to do that, So what are they dreaming about? We all know that it's not heaven across the ocean. So maybe they would be killed, maybe they would be kidnapped. So what pushes them? Does that mean that, everything in where they come from is completely desperate? Like, do they have promises from the smugglers? Are people receiving them from the other end? Explain this to us.
Right. Well, most important push factors. What to take on this kind of journey, to take on the risks, to take on the uncertainty. Yes, things are so bad where you are. It is constant risk of violence, or it is you see no opportunity for a job, you see no opportunity for your children, you see no development in terms of education, you see risk on the horizon. I mean, people are a little more informed nowadays, also because of the internet. They hear about things going on. They can also be misinformed, let's be honest. But then they can also hear from the opportunities in Europe. There will be other people. You tend to go where you know someone, or a lot of migrant communities will go to similar places because someone else or a cousin or a family friend has gone to where they've gone. So you tend to follow similar tracks, and you've heard, and someone might say, and again, is there misinformation there? Is that all total truth? Of course, there are rumors and misunderstandings, and I've also just in conversation with people here in Kenya, if people find out where I'm from, will say, oh, well, you just swim in money, right? So there is also this false image of how opportunities are just abundant and everyone is just, crazily rich in Europe or the US or wherever. So all of that is true. Either you're pushed by the tremendous disparity or difficulty of the situation you're in, and you're drawn by what the stories you hear, whether directly from a cousin, from someone from your community, or from these images that you get. Now, put these two things together, you make a comparison of how your current situation is and the lack of envisioning yourself in a happy, prosperous future there, and you go. Now, that doesn't mean every migrant has to come with, the saddest story ever. Yes, many of them go through tremendously traumatic experiences, but I don't think we need to measure, only if it's so traumatic or so bad, only you can come, right? If you can't envision your future, if you don't see a future for your children, there are plenty of good reasons to leave, to look for something else. Now, my parents did the same in less traumatic experiences, but you are imagining a better future for yourself and your kids. And that can come to varying degrees of, tragic stories. But also, there are plenty of migrants who come with high level degrees, and they just cannot make a living with them in those countries where they are for all sorts of reasons. And I don't think we need to. I mean, there's so much judgment that goes into the migrant, right? He's scrutinized or she is scrutinized for what they can bring, how traumatized they are. And I think it should be seen in a much more humane light. I mean, people come because they want a better future. Can we help make their future better where they are and in Europe and everywhere else? I mean, all human beings deserve the possibility to imagine a better future for them and their children, and we can work on that wherever the case is.
Absolutely. But what about the smugglers and the trafficking networks? Do they exploit the situation of the migrants or the conflict situations when there is a conflict, they start pushing people, encouraging people to leave?
Well, from what I've never dealt with smugglers directly, but from what I've seen, humans are tremendously entrepreneurial and will find a way to make money out of basically any situation. And what happens
Mhm.
when you have conflicts and you have political tensions and issues of, good governance, then obviously you have porous borders, porous governance in general. So you can smuggle people, goods, diamonds, drugs, all these things, arms, they all kind of can flow in similar ways when they, because the same thing, similar types of situation where people are just trying to find a way to make money out of anything. And some of these networks are quite, again, entrepreneurial and good at finding any way. And of course, they will find a way to market, oh, you want to leave? And so obviously, I mean, you hear these crazy stories of the high prices that people have to pay, the risks that smugglers take too, but the risks that they put migrants in, whether it's crossing the desert or crossing, in these overcrowded boats, which just seems absolutely crazy. Why do people do those things? Why is there someone selling this option? Because A, there's a way of making money out of it, there's an opportunity there, and because we've created a system that there's no other more humane way of doing it. We've allowed the political, international systems have allowed it to be so complicated. It's almost like the best barrier they have. We won't make it easy to get any other way in. We'll make visas hard. We'll make everything else complicated. So then will people always find a workaround? They, that's the human drive that people have, both to survive and with hope, and to be entrepreneurial. I mean, it brings out the best and the worst of humanity, unfortunately.
Well, on this very sad note, we continue to our second section, which is peace building as a solution to migration crisis. So at least there's hope when it comes to solving these problems and helping migrants with peace building programs. So you've worked on peace processes in different regions. What strategies have proven effective in preventing conflict-driven displacement?
Well, listen, obviously the best this prevention is prevention itself. I mean, if we can avoid conflicts getting out of hand, if we can avoid actually, I mean, unfortunately, humans have found this way of dealing with their issues, which tends to be with violence, as the, easiest way to get things done.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, it makes a lot of money to a lot of, at least certain people, that is just the go-to conflict management system. So we allow for these things. And then the collateral damage of people and refugees and environmental damage is kind of an afterthought. Now, given that, okay, peace building research has also shown if you invest in prevention, it costs much less than reconstruction, right? But that is a harder sell because you have to do the counterfactual. You have to imagine, the tree that falls down makes more noise than the tree, the forest that grows. To
Mhm.
prove that it costs less to like have humane ways of dealing with violence, humane ways of dealing with migrants is it just makes more news when you hear the sad stories that come afterwards, right? And we don't want to see these things, so we push them aside and we push them to detention camps and so on. So anyway, back to your question of prevention. They talk a lot about in the peace building field of how do you connect peace building, humanitarian work, development work, even how do and that those three you would call the sort of triple nexus. And there's been talk about this for years now, but also it used to be thought that, okay, first you do humanitarian work, then you do the peace building after the conflict, and then you do development. But that very siloed way of thinking obviously is not how reality works. And we often are also much more aware now that not only do those three sectors need to collaborate, but also human rights needs to be involved and businesses And how do migration and refugee services fit into it? Now, I'm not saying create one big organization where everything is handled, but these sectors need to dialogue with one another, learn from each other, and see that for the migrant, for the human being, they could care less if you're coming to talk to them as a humanitarian, as a peace builder, as a development officer. They're going to need development work. They're going to need jobs even during a crisis, right? They're going to need people to respect their human rights even before the war is over. So
Yeah.
what works are when these different institutions and humans that work for them can find creative ways of collaborating across the silos and creative ways of learning from each other, because it's true, the sectors are different and they have different experiences and expertise and perhaps even language. But there's so much that we can learn that the immigration, refugee communities learned from the business community. How can create jobs also for migrants and so on? And then how much, the people who deal with peace building, how much could they learn also from the humanitarians and so forth? So all I'm saying is what works is when these different sectors get out of their silos and find ways of creatively working together and learning from each other. And that, I would say, is an important thing, not just to do with migration, but for climate change, for peace in general, and everywhere across the board.
Absolutely. And so when it comes to international organizations and host countries, they're also part of this big time. So what role do these stakeholders, I would say, have to do when it comes to stabilizing regions to reduce migration pressures?
Well, I mean, international organizations are made up of states, right? And states have interests, and states can have, like humans, both good and perhaps less noble interests. A lot of times they can have their self-interest. Now, why also is migration and the issues of refugees also treated, sometimes with what can seem like, oh, we're being generous, we're giving them camps, but at the same time, we never want to, many countries don't want to fully give the refugees or migrants rights because, oh, well, then they'll stay. If we make it too good for them, that'll cost us too much, and then they'll take our jobs. There's all these narratives that you hear. So it's like, of course, we need to take care, but maybe not too much, right? And, oh, if we integrate them too much, is that a bad thing? So there's a debate in the obviously in this sector of how to do these things better. Certain countries have found ways of being more hospitable, even finding ways to give jobs, making sure, because a lot of times you have a disruption, a total disruption when people are leaving, right? And you don't get to your destination overnight. How's the health of those people along the way? How is the education of those children when they're stuck along the way, right? How are we dealing with all the other needs that people have, whether from trauma or processing also of work possibilities, all those things in between. It's a long process, and a lot of times someone is stuck along that process, and many don't get to the end of that process, right?
Yeah.
So the IOs, the international organizations and host countries, I think could do a lot more reflecting on how do we make this process as humane as possible. And I understand that there can be fears of, if we make it too easy, then all of a sudden they'll all come or they'll all be flooded.
Yeah.
But I'm not saying, just open all borders as if there was no issue to it. I'm saying humans are good at creating processes. We can hopefully make them more humane and think of all these different elements and not look at it just from one perspective. So I think international organizations especially need to find ways, as they are very often spaces for states to come together to learn from each other and then support each other, because states have different levels of means. That's also what international organizations are there for. When funds are pooled, then how can we make sure that some of the countries that host the most refugees obviously don't have the same resources as others. So how can we think all this through? And I know big bureaucracies and big organizations have their own problems, but we need to find better ways of managing this. And not to say, I mean, one thing I'll add on this, that it's only the institution, the big institution, that helps, right? There are so many small organizations, local churches and mosques and associations that do so much important work with migrant communities everywhere. And a lot of times they're quicker to respond because they're there on the ground. Before a big organization gets mobilized, you have the people who are already there, right? Whether it's religious institutions, whether it's a women's association, whether it's an environmental association, humans have all sorts of ways of organizing themselves that are already available. So how can we capacitate and work with those, right? Especially in some of the conflicts that we've seen arise over the last 2, 3 years. It took a while before the international community got organized. It's obviously more political for the international community to organize and decide how to do this and not, annoy any of the, political sensitivities in this side or that side. So how do we, in the meantime, empower, get resources, get opportunities for these local associations and networks that are already there doing the important work? So I think that's another aspect, not just how can the international organizations do their work better, how can they collaborate with the locals, even get out of the way and not be as bulky as they are, and allow for the important work to be done where it is already on the ground.
Right. So everything we've talked about so far is when the conflict is already there and the migrants are flowing across the world. But there's a step ahead of that, which is, stopping the conflict from happening in the first place, so that we don't create migrants. So I guess the million-dollar question would be, is there a way to integrate migration policies into conflict resolution efforts? Is it
Well,
happening anywhere in the world?
well, I mean, nowadays, we've had, in the recent years, the most amount of migrants and refugees like we've ever had, right? It's the numbers are high, and what tends to affect people nowadays is also not just the numbers, but there are costs. I know every statistic is actually just a human being, but when it touches the purse of these governments and organizations that are having to foot the bill on these things, then it becomes a little more real. So we've been able to calculate more. This has a cost, and there's an opportunity cost as well, that if you don't integrate or deal with the issues that migrants have, there are other costs that come along, right? If you don't find ways for migrants to deal with trauma, to get back into education, to get with work, it's so short-sighted to say, I have an issue with this other country or in this region, and we're going to deal with violence. We're much more aware of that, the impact that will cause. And there's more information out there, and we have other stories to see. We have much more oversight, or not oversight. We have a greater vision of the tremendous pain that we're causing. And I think we, international organizations like Mediterranean Dialogue, need to get these stories more out there so people realize, and people can be more informed when they're voting for their governments, and pressure these international organizations and governments for the policies that they take on, to realize that there is a cost, a huge human cost, when you just use violence somewhere and you move people. And there's a huge cost to climate change, for example, because people start moving, and that leads also to conflict of different kinds and all sorts of other disruption. To understand the human cost is one of numbers, is one of costs, is one of statistics, but it's also one of human stories that we need to tell. And we need to get better at capturing those. And there is a lot more we can do to give the migrant, the refugee, a human face. And unfortunately, I think it also is in the interest of, the powerful sometimes to not give the human face to these things, or sometimes only to show the sad stories of when these things actually don't go well and someone is not integrated and there's violence and so on. And that's where I think we need to be dealing with the trauma. And that, unfortunately, we don't do as well as we could.
This is actually section 3, trauma healing and reintegration for migrants. So we have migrants, they're traumatized, they've been through a lot. So as you know, many migrants experience severe trauma. So how do you think, how can trauma healing programs help them reintegrate? And are they even realizing what they're going through, and they're willing to cooperate so that people like yourself can help them, get better?
Well, there's a phrase that I heard a few years ago that I like a lot, which says, wounds that are not transformed are transferred, right? And perhaps you could say a migrant is maybe even traumatized, various times, but you could think of 3 specific moments. The trauma that they're in, that is driving them out, that they feel like to leave from. The trauma that they certainly endure on these, tremendous voyages that they undertake. And then the trauma of arriving someplace and perhaps the integration process being complicated and not finding work and so on and so forth. So the trauma of leaving, trauma of the actual voyage, and the trauma of arriving. Now, I think in general, not just with migrants or refugees, and not, I think in general, we don't understand trauma nearly as well as we should. We have the sense that a soldier can come back and have, post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, but we don't realize how traumatizing many of the experiences that we have are. Even just, I mean, we're all kind of traumatized from COVID in a certain sense, which I don't think we've all fully processed. We're traumatized a lot we all have wounds from our past, and we're traumatized by the images that we see. But a lot of people, even like myself, working in the sector for peace, you will be traumatized by the work that you do, even if you're not there under the violence, under the bombs yourself.
You're dealing with them.
We're dealing with that.
Yeah.
You're hearing those stories. Even psychologists, they know if they hear a lot of traumatizing stories, they need to process that also and get support. So I would say those working for peace of all kinds, I mean, we all could use more support and be more aware of the wounds that we have. That is just a general statement. Now, certainly migrants will come with all level of trauma, and I have certainly not come across enough mental health support, for migrants, for people suffering from, the effects of war who didn't leave. I mean, the trauma is huge, and like I said, if you don't process it, you transfer it. Whether you transfer it to your own children or transfer it to the enemy that you've kind of have or have been projected to have. And that, I think, is just a general story. And a lot of times we get this sense that, oh, I'm strong or I'm fine. And I think migrants have this tremendous resilience. They've been through so much. They had the courage to take on this this journey. There is a certain amount of adrenaline, even for soldiers, that gets you through the actual stressful moment.
Yeah.
That trauma comes back after, right? And we don't realize or haven't studied enough how much it is. So I would definitely advocate for much more mental health services for migrants, for people who work in this field in general, for just understanding that and telling of the stories also in the media, for people realizing why someone takes such a crazy story. They're not just here to steal your job, right? It's to give a human face to all of this, and to give the human dignity back to the migrant as well, who has definitely had a lot of it taken away by the traumas that they and the experiences they had. I think is an important element and would help do all this other stuff that we're saying better, right? How can we think through connecting the education policy to the health policy to the peace building stuff? Giving all this a more human face and realizing how much trauma affects us, and I think affects every conflict. I mean, we could go and talk for hours about why some of these intractable conflicts we have around the world are really just, made up of traumatized victims on both sides. And when you're traumatized, you don't see clearly anymore. And that, unfortunately, justifies a lot of other things that you do. And if we could create more spaces to hold, I like this phrase. It said to judge. I mean, it was said by a Jesuit priest about the poor. I would rather, instead of judging the poor for how they hold it, I would rather, be in awe of what they've been asked to carry, right? And if we could have a little more humane to that, and I'm not saying that, we don't consider all the other implications of these things, but everyone has a much larger burden than we can imagine. And if we could deal with it with a little more humanity, then I think we could find also the creativity to come up with better solutions.
Thank you very much, Rainer. It's been a pleasure. We certainly have to have you one more time, actually many times in our podcast, because you're very insightful about all of these things, and hopefully you can come back with some more helpful stories and successful stories when it comes to dealing with migrants that made it elsewhere, maybe got back home and, brought peace back to their homeland, and also rose above their trauma somehow with your help and the help of all those working in this field. Thank you very much, Rainer.
Thank you too. Good conversation. Looking forward to the next one.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.